Hi, and welcome to Across the Desk. Well, I really don't have a show for you this week. It's Memorial Weekend, and next week I have a special guest I'm going to have on, and I intend to have that as my 20th episode of this season, which will make it our last episode, and that will be the last episode of the season. So right now I'm going to play an encore of one we did a year ago, and I'd like to do it because June 1st is an anniversary of sorts. It's an anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. Did a show last year on it, and we're going to play it as an encore event. This is Across the Desk. We'll see you next week. Hi, and welcome to Across the Desk. Well, here we are, episode 20, and at the end of another season. And this is kind of a special show as to where it falls on our calendar. So I kind of wanted to make it a little bit of a special event. So this week's show, we're going to commemorate the 100-year anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. Now, 100 years ago, in the town of Tulsa, we had a bit of an incident that went nationwide. It was big time. Had National Guard called, the head of the U.S. departments were called, and sheriffs and everybody else were called in, and whole sections of north end of Tulsa, Oklahoma was burnt to the ground and looted, and people were killed. Now, the curious thing about this is, here I am, born and raised in Oklahoma, 5th generation on my dad's side, 4th on my mother's, and I went to school, high school, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And back in the mid-'80s, we had a class called Oklahoma History, which I believe they still have today. But I remember in the mid-'80s not learning about the Tulsa Race Massacre in school, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, no less. But that almost makes sense, because I guess the wounds were so deep and so raw that they didn't want to teach that to us. They didn't want their kids to be saddled with knowing the truth about the town that they lived in and that they grew up in, and why it's so segregated, as it still is today. See, what happened was, a long time ago, a black man was in an elevator with a white woman. Well, that white woman said that this black man made advances to her. Well, they arrested said black man. And it became a big deal. The papers got involved. Tulsa Tribune, who I don't think is around anymore, put out a big deal about the Negro and how he was, so lewd to white women, and that there's going to be a lynching in town. Well, this spurred people to action. So they went down to downtown Tulsa and were demanding that they turn over this young black man to be lynched at the streets of Tulsa for supposed advances he made towards a white woman. So that's what this all was about. Now, what happened next was not a de-escalation of events, because it could have been easily avoided. We could have de-escalated this. The sheriff's office could have just said, hey, people, go home. We're not going to do anything. Go home, don't do nothing. He could have at least talked to the black community who were begging the sheriff, hey, man, give them some protections, do something, enlist our veterans, because black people, veterans, lived in North Tulsa, said, use them, at least something. Wouldn't do it. So this thing was perpetuated on. So, in a second round of events, those same people in the black community begged the sheriff for some protections again. Since they didn't get it, they went down there. Now this is an escalation. Next thing you know, a shot is fired and who knows what, and the whole thing kicks off. That night, gunfire, people in the streets, chaos. By the next morning, they had done a major incursion into the black community in North Tulsa. And what they did on June 1st, the atrocities that were committed, was just devastating to our state. So I get why they don't want to teach it here. It's a hard lesson. It's hard to look at yourself sometimes and see where you've gone wrong and where you can do better. And sometimes people just don't want to look at that and just say, oh, well, we can do better, we don't need to look at it. But they don't want to look at it because they're cowards. But we really need to look at it. One, there were people who lost their lives, their livelihoods, and their wealth that day. Real people. Human beings. I know they might have been black, but they were humans. And they had things, and rights, and freedoms, like everybody else. No matter if some people don't think they did. They really do. Now, I get it. Sundown laws and everything else designed to go after people of certain races. And this is the kinds of things that House Bill 1775 is forbidding you to teach. Because, see, there's a brand of white people out there who just makes them feel too sad. They feel too much angst when they talk about things of white supremacy or systemic racism in our laws and institutions. Gets them all angsty and upsets their stomachs. So they can't handle it very well and would rather we not talk about it. Just shove it to the side. Things are different. That's in the past. But we shouldn't do that because, one, there were lives lost. They deserve to be honored. Like the surgeon. Guy was a learned surgeon. Medical field guy. Medical doctor. Leader of the community. Not in trouble with the law whatsoever. What do? They drag him outside and kill him execution style. That's what they did to him. And then proceeded to loot his house. Took his silver, his fancy telephone, everything else. Looted it. Just took it for themselves. Because that's what they did. That's exactly what it was about. To come down to it, it wasn't just about this one young black man and his perceived advances towards a white woman. It was pretty much based on envy and jealousy of the black community. Because here we are. We have what was called Black Wall Street. They called it that at the time. And they called it that not just in Oklahoma. This was a nationwide event. It was one of the richest communities of color in the nation. Now, you got to think here. If it's one of the richest communities of color in the nation at the time, it's bringing in quite a bit of GDP. And at the time, 20-30% of the state's GDP was based on Black Wall Street. So when they destroyed Greenwood District, when they looted those homes and businesses and stole their land later to where they couldn't rebuild, they wiped out a big chunk of Oklahoma's GDP. They really did harm to our overall economy in this state by doing that. And quite frankly, this state hasn't recovered since. It hasn't been the same. Not GDP-wise, not wealth-wise or anything. Because the white people in Tulsa at the time, jealousy and envy, couldn't have that. These black people who just got emancipated not 40, 50 years earlier, having all this stuff. More stuff than these whites in the south part of town had. Because it was even noted later that black women would point out where white women were wearing the jewelry that they had stolen from them. Wearing it in public. Blatant. Like, this should be mine anyway. It shouldn't be yours. You were just slaves not that long ago. How could you have all this fancy stuff? Not realizing how much that economy in North Tulsa supplemented everybody else in this state. Not realizing it. Totally devastating an economy, devastating a region, and devastating the state's GDP. That's exactly what they did through ignorance. So ignorant. We're going to destroy this. We're going to get rid of it. And we're not going to let them rebuild because of the color of their skin. because of the jealousy they had because they were so successful. And that's what it's about. They were so jealous of their success that we couldn't take it as a state. We couldn't accept this extra boon of GDP and economy because it was a black man that did it. Think about that. That's what that was about. That's what that was over. In the end, that's really what it was over. There was no reason to devastate it to the ground other than the fact that here was a bunch of black people in the north end of Tulsa who had a bunch of stuff that the white people in the south end didn't have and who coveted it. Obviously, because when they went in to destroy and burn down Greenwood, before they went in and burned it to the ground, they looted it. They took it. It's exactly what they did. If it wasn't all about some young man hitting on a white woman, then why did they need to loot and devastate the economy of one of the best and most rocking economies in the nation for black people? Why did they have to do that? And it goes on to so many other things that we can't even teach anymore. The systemic racism of the sheriff's office. Can't even teach about that thanks to House Bill 1775, which is now law. We can't teach you about the systemic racism in the sheriff's office, deputizing all the white people to go after the black people in the north end of town, deputizing them to arrest them in mass. And that's what they did. They arrested them in mass, out of their homes in the middle of the night. Kids, babies, old women, and men. Took them down to the convention center and stuffed them there. While what happened with nobody in that town after that? They looted it all. No black residents in there. We got rid of them. So now what? It's open for looting. That's exactly what they did. And the Oklahoma National Guard, they let them do it. They totally let them do it. And in some respects, might have even been part of the looting. That's what they did. And that's before they firebombed it from the sky. Before they had turpentine balls thrown from airplanes to set everything on fire. And that was, which was after execution style shooting of black men and women in North Tulsa. All because of some perceived young man hitting on a white woman. But that wasn't the real case at all. As a matter of fact, at the end of the day, all the charges against the young man who this all became a part of and started from, they were dropped. Nothing ever happened with it. So that tells you right there it was a lot more than that. It was about the jealousy of white people in South Tulsa to those in the north side of town. So they devastated a whole neighborhood. They devastated blocks, burned it to the ground. And then what they did afterwards, how they went to the legislature and they passed bills and laws to systemically keep black people from rebuilding. They made them do so many different things before they could even build. They had so many stipulations they had to go through before they could even get a permit to build from the city, who had their own requirements. So it made the land worthless. They weren't going to let them rebuild there. They wanted the Negro out of Tulsa. They even had postcards and sold postcards as like state tourism. Like this was a great thing. Yeah, we burned them out, got rid of them, took their wealth, all of it, devastated that economy and ruined a nice almost 1/3 of our GDP. Aren't we swell people? And this is exactly what they want to sweep under the rug. They want to sweep it under the rug. Of course they do. It's a big black eye on Oklahoma. It still is. It's one of the reasons why we're still where we are today. And we still have that thinking today. Here we are, 4 or 5 generations later, and there are still people in this state who think the way of those people in Tulsa did, who went to the black side of town and destroyed it. There's still people in this state who think that way, who think that that's proper values, that they're preserving something, or that they're making the state better by destroying a part of the economy. They think that's okay. And it's not. It's disgusting. it's a black eye. It makes me sad when I read about when I go through the commission report that they did, that was commissioned by Frank Keating, by the way, Republican governor. When that came out and I read the whole thing, it was sad. I learned things in it I never even knew or even was taught in school to know. It was sad. It was sad about the loss of life. It was sad about the loss of wealth that was lost. That was really sad to me. They totally took this community's GDP and made it zero. They totally did that. Took their wealth and then took their ability through state laws to keep from getting that wealth back. So disgusting. So infuriating on so many levels that people in this state thought that way. And that's how they did business back in the day. And this is why it's important. It's so important to learn about history. It's so important to learn about not just the good, feel-good stuff about history, but the actual bad stuff. The actual things that were harmful and detrimental to our society, and how they were detrimental to our society. Those are important things, so that we don't do them again, or that we perpetuate the stuff that was good, and that we don't do the stuff that was bad. Exactly. That's why we learn that stuff. So here we are, 100 years later, after the Greenwood fires, destruction of the town, and the massacre of the black community in Tulsa. 100 years later. And I'm not so sure how much further we've come. We have the Tulsa Massacre Commission, who had to kick the governor off the board because, one, he didn't show up to meetings, and the other thing is, he signed that bill into law that kept you from teaching about the systemic problem that happened within the Tulsa Race Massacre. You can still teach about the Tulsa Race Massacre, but you just can't teach that systemic racism had a problem with it, or that white supremacy exists anywhere within it. Oh, and that laws weren't put in place later to keep the black man in North Tulsa from rebuilding. Because it's in there. It's in there today. You can see it. Any county. Some counties are online and easy to get to. Oklahoma County, for instance. Go to Oklahoma County's website. Go to the Oklahoma County Clerk. Look up plats. Plats from subdivisions. Go to the old ones. Look up old ones. And you'll see in their covenants. Covenants will say, no black man, no Negro is allowed to own property within this subdivision. If it's found out that a black man owns it, it gets reverted back to the company. Who's the company? Well, it's the developer who started it. So if you sold property before the 60s, before the civil rights, if you sold property to a black man in a neighborhood where the covenant in the plat said you weren't allowed to sell to a black man, well, the developer could come and confiscate that property from the black man and then resell it, of course, at a profit, major, of course. And that's how it worked. And so we don't have those anymore. Thanks to the Civil Rights Act, those provisions in those plats became moot points. You can't enforce that law. You cannot enforce it anymore. You can't force a black person to sell his property because he bought property in a neighborhood where the covenant says a black person couldn't own it. And these are actual laws we had in this state that they don't want you to teach about anymore because it makes people like Rob Standridge too sad. Makes him a little too angsty and upsets his stomach a little too much. Talk about things like that. So, institutions of higher learning, high schools, OU, OSU, can't teach about that stuff anymore. Can't teach about diversity and systemic racism. Can't do that. And it makes me wonder, how's that going to affect our universities on national levels, international levels? I really think people will take a look at those and go, I don't know that I want to go to school there. I don't think it's a selling point. As a matter of fact, I think it's a negative selling point as to why people would want to come to our universities when you have laws like this that won't let you teach things about the Tulsa Race Massacre in certain lights. You can still teach about it, but you can't say that systemic racism was a problem. You can't do that. So here we are 100 years later, still with some of the same problems and issues we had 100 years ago that fomented the hate and the violence that burned the Greenwood district to the ground. Such a vile display, and a sad one, a sad part of our history that we should really analyze, that we should really look at, so that not only we don't repeat that, but how we can make that better. How can we make those communities thrive? Because it was possible. At one point, it was Black Wall Street for the nation, not just Oklahoma. So we know it's possible. It's just we definitely have certain factions and people in this state that won't let it happen. And as I want to go on commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, I am an Oklahoman, born and raised. My family, on my mom's side, 4th generation, and from Tulsa, living there. So I'm a product of this. I'm from it. I live there. I'm from Northeast Oklahoma. Originally, that's where I grew up. My whole family's from there, mom and dad's side. How I ended up in Oklahoma City area is a long story. It has to do with really education and going to school here and staying for the opportunities. And that's what that's all about. You know, the opportunities and where they're at. They took these opportunities away from North Tulsa 100 years ago. A thriving community with its own banks, churches, schools, grocery stores, everything, entertainment. And that was wiped out in a day. They burned it to the ground. A brand new church. Churches. Why would you burn a church to the ground? I don't get that. They burned these to the ground. And they killed people indiscriminately. Like the surgeon I was telling you about. That's just such a sad story. It's infuriating to me that a community leader like this guy, educated, was such a threat to white people, was such an envious point that he had all this stuff that they coveted, that they had to kill him. That's just disgusting. And the most infuriating thing about all this, no one was ever held accountable. No one was ever arrested for anyone murdered. No one was ever tried. No commission was ever assigned to look at it. Nothing was ever done. It was just swept under the rug. The Red Cross wasn't even allowed at first to go in to set up tents for the homeless. They had to sleep outside. It was June, okay. At least it's not too bad. But still, they shouldn't have had to do that. Drag whatever not burned mattress outside and sleep on it. Because they weren't allowing the Red Cross to come in and set up tents for these people. Give them water and food. They weren't allowed to. They shut them down. They wanted them out. They wanted them dead. They wanted to take their stuff. And that's exactly what they did. Well, the laws that came in later on how they couldn't rebuild a certain way. And so all this land and stuff reverted to, well, the white people in power at the time. And they were squeezed out. And they were squeezed further east and further north, out of Tulsa, or even completely out of the state. Because that was the goal. They didn't want it here. They didn't want Black Wall Street in Oklahoma. And that's really a sad point. And it's not just sad. It's almost, I don't know what to call it. It's very disappointing. Because here we are with a governor who wants to have a top 10 state. Top 10 state. But he's still espousing the same attitudes and the same feelings that devastated the Greenwood district and took out a quarter to a third of our GDP in one blow. Because, I want it here. So, I guess it just depends on what it means by being a top 10 state. I don't know what he means by that anymore. Especially when he signs in laws like he does on the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. Is the guy just really that stupid? Is he really just that unempathetic, not able to see what people are going through or anything like that? It's just not, just so one-dimensional he can't fathom other aspects of what he does? Who knows? But anyway, this is Across the Desk, and I hope we commemorate this 100-year anniversary somberly, with reflection, and with the truth of looking at ourselves like we need to do. Well, that's all I have for this week. We're going to take a short break, like we do every so often. 20 seasons, 20 episodes. Here we go. Just got done with it. We'll see you in about a month and a half. 6 to 8 weeks like normal. And we'll start up season 4. It's Across the Desk. We'll see you next season.